Hello, everybody. So we are back with the tracts of the nervous system. So before I start, let me ask you a question. If the neurons do a crime, where do you put them? If the neurons do a crime, what do you call them? The answer is a brain cell. This was just to ease out and tell you that in the last lecture, we had studied about the lateral spinothalamic tract and the anterior spinothalamic tracts. We have seen that the lateral spinothalamic tract is concerned with the sensations of pain and temperature, whereas the anterior spinothalamic tract is concerned with the sensation of touch and pressure. So here I would like to specify that the touch is the crude touch, and this crude touch is the touch which is a more primitive touch, whereas today we are going to move ahead and we are going to see the dorsal column medial lemniscal system. So before I start with the dorsal column medial lemniscal system, I will give you a very faint view of what exactly does this dorsal column medial lemniscal system do. It actually is responsible for the conscious proprioceptive sensations, that are the sensations of the locomotor system, a very, very important segment. Now here again we have a type of touch, but it is different from the touch of the anterior spinothalamic tracts, and this is the fine touch or the discriminative touch. The touch which has got very fine characters, very fine descriptions. And another sensation which comes here is the vibratory sensation. Now, here I would like to tell you one more thing, that for accuracy, for more defined accuracy, we have the dorsal column medial lemniscal system, which is also called as commonly the dorsal column. Here, the sensations of fine touch and proprioception, which are considered to be the more evolved sensation, are of a high velocity. They are more myelinated neurons, and the variety of sensations here is lesser as compared to the anterolateral system, where the velocity of the sensation is low, myelination is less, but the variety of sensations is more. So here, if we move ahead, in the coming slides, we will be seeing that the lower part of the dorsal column carries fibers towards the medial side. That is, the lower part of our body is represented on the medial side of the dorsal column system, whereas the upper part of our body is represented on the lateral side of the dorsal column system. This spatial arrangement in the spinal cord is very, very important, because if there is a lesion, if there is a tumor, there is a growth which compresses, then the location is very, very important. And this is what we find out in the CT scan and the MRI, that what is the location of the lesion, the extent of the lesion, the kind of compression it is doing, and what symptoms it is producing. So, moving on to the next slide, we will see. So, we have been studying the spinal cord, and we know that the spinal cord is located in the vertebral column. I'm putting forth a picture for you so that you understand how the spinal cord is placed in the vertebral column. This will give you a very clear idea of how the small spinal cord is seen in between the vertebral column. So now we know that the discriminative touch, the vibratory sense, and the conscious muscle joint sensations, all these have got their specific receptors. The receptors are the Golgi body tendons, They are the Pacinian corpuscles, the Meissner's corpuscles, the muscle spindle, the joint receptors. And we know that these sensations, they enter the spinal cord via the first order neuron. And this first order neuron enters the spinal cord in the posterior white column of the same side, and without getting synapsed, it moves upwards, that is on the same side. So a very important fact is that the dorsal column is ipsilateral in the spinal cord. That is, there is no crossing over in the spinal cord. Crossing over occurs, but it occurs in the brain. Moving further, we see that the long ascending fibers, they travel upwards in the posterior column of the same side. And here they are known as the fasciculus, gracilis, and cuneatus. Now the word fasciculus means a bundle. And these are bundles of nerve fibers. These are tracts. And this fasciculus gracilis brings the information from the lower part of the body, is more medial, whereas the fasciculus cuneatus brings the sensations from the upper part of the body and is more lateral. So let us have a clearer look. The fasciculus gracilis brings information from the lower thoracic, lumbar, and sacral regions, including our lower limbs, whereas the fasciculus cuneatus brings sensations only from the thoracic and cervical segments, including our upper limb. Now, the first order neuron in this case is pretty long, and it gets synapsed, or it gets terminated at the nucleus gracilis and cuneatus respectively, which is located in the medulla oblongata of the same side. And we all know that the lowermost part of the brain is the brain stem, which is formed by the midbrain, pons, and the medulla, which are uppermost, middle, and lower parts of the brain stem. So the medulla oblongata is the part of the brain stem which is lying in close approximation to the spinal cord. So ipsilaterally on the same side, this first order neuron ascends and gets terminated on the nucleus. Nucleus is a collection of nerve cell bodies within the central nervous system. So the names are respective, gracilis and cuneatus. Gracilis is more medial, cuneatus is more lateral. Both are on the medulla oblongata of the same side. Here you can see a very, very clear pictorial depiction that the lower segments are bringing the sensation from the lower half of the body, carrying it to the nucleus gracilis, and the upper part is being carried to the nucleus cuneatus in the medulla. Now taking it further, we see that the second order neuron originates from the medulla oblongata, respectively from the nucleus gracilis and cuneatus. And here, these fibers cross the median plane and reach the opposite side. You can see it very clearly. This type of crossing over of these fibers, which are now known as the internal arcuate fibers, is known as the sensory decussation. Decussation is crossing over, and sensory decussation is crossing over of the sensory fiber. And after crossing over, these internal arcuate fibers ascend up, and now they are known as the medial lemniscus. And hence, this system is known as the dorsal column medial lemniscal system. Now we see beautifully how this medial lemniscus passes from the medulla oblongata to the pons and to the midbrain, that it is basically ascending in the brain stem. And here in the thalamus, so we know thalamus is a rich collection of gray matter, nerve cell bodies. And last time also in the spinothalamic tracts, we saw that the thalamus was the site of entry into the brain, and how it formed the junctions and how it led to the internal capsule and the corona radiata, etc. So again, we see that the third order neuron is going to originate in the ventral posterolateral nucleus of the thalamus, where the second order neuron has terminated. And here, From here, we know there is a small space called the internal capsule from which these fibers will pass. And after crossing the internal capsule, they get spread out. These fibers cover up a very major part of the sensory cortex. They spread out and they are known as the corona radiata. And now they reach the post-central gyrus of the cerebral cortex, which is the sensory cortex. Again, the areas 3, 1 and 2. Very important. So now if we have a close look at the diagrammatic representation of the pathways in both the types of sections, we can see very clearly how the fibers enter via the spinal cord, ascend via the medulla, pons, midbrain, via the thalamus, reach the sensory cortex. You can clearly see it. There is also crossing over, but in this case, it is in the brain. So if you are asked that are the fibers of the dorsal column ipsilateral or contralateral in the spinal cord, you have to say they are ipsilateral in the spinal cord, but the decussation occurs at the level of the medulla, that is in the brainstem. Okay. Now, if we move further towards the clinical application of our knowledge, we will see that these sensations are responsible for the locomotory movements and for the fine touch. So in case if there is an injury at any particular level in the spinal cord, then there will be on the same side, we know it's ipsilateral in the spinal cord, so on the same side of the injury, below the level of the lesion, the muscles, joint sense, the sense of position, that is proprioception, sense of vibration, and tactile discrimination, that is 2-point discrimination. Discrimination between two types of touches. This is a part of the fine touch. All these will be lost. But again, I want to emphasize one thing, that we are learning all the tracts in isolation. We are learning them individually for the purpose of understanding, for the purpose of improving our depth. But in reality, it is very rare. ऐसा बिल्कुल नहीं होता कि आपके पास स्पाइनल कॉर्ड की इंजरी हो और आपको सिर्फ एक ही ट्रैक्ट के इंजर होने की सिम्टम्स मिले. ऐसा इसलिए नहीं होता क्योंकि इंजरी का कॉज यदि कोई कट है शार्प इक्विपमेंट से, यदि कोई एक्सीडेंट है, यदि कोई बड़ा ट्यूमर है उसे कंप्रेस कर रहा है, ऐसी कोई भी चीज होती है तो वो किसी एक सिंगल नर्व ट्रैक्ट को कंप्रेस करे या डैमेज करे, इसकी पॉसिबिलिटी नेग्लिजिबल होती है. Now, if we proceed further, so there we are done with the tracts of the spine all the way to the cortex. Okay, so we have seen that the ascending tracts begin at the spinal cord but terminate on two locations in the brain. They are the cortex, cerebral cortex, or the cerebellum. So we have done with the tracts which are terminating on the cerebral cortex. They were the anterolateral systems and the dorsal column system. Okay, now we are coming to the spinocerebellar tracts. So the spinocerebellar tracts are the tracts between the spinal cord and the cerebellum, and we all know that the cerebellum are two in number, two structures, the cerebellar hemispheres are two in number, and they are located on both the sides of the brain stem. And so the transmission of the nerves or the conduction is finally from the brainstem to the cerebellum. And here there is a very important thing anatomically which I would like to make clear for you all, that when the fibers go from the medulla to the cerebellum, this is known as the inferior cerebellar peduncle. When the fibers go from the pons to the cerebellum, this is known as the mid-cerebellar peduncle. When the fibers go from the midbrain to the cerebellum, it is known as the superior cerebellar peduncle. What I mean to say is that from the brainstem, the lower, middle, and upper part, fibers or tracts can reach the cerebellum and they will be named accordingly: the inferior, the middle, and the superior cerebellar peduncles respectively. Now, moving further, I'm going to tell you about the posterior and the anterior spinocerebellar tracts. As the name suggests, the posterior tracts are on the back side and the anterior tracts are on the front side. Now, these spinocerebellar tracts, they are going to take sensations which we are not conscious about. This we have learned earlier also, that the cerebral cortex receives the sensations which we are conscious about, whereas the cerebellum receives the sensations which we are not conscious about. And so the larger segment of the cerebellar sensations are the spinocerebellar sensations are the proprioceptive informations, that is related to the muscle spindles, to the Golgi tendon organs. Now, where are these Golgi tendon organs located? Each muscle has got two tendinous structures at its end, and these tendinous structures are sensitive to the stretch in the muscle spindle. And here is the Golgi tendon organ, which is the proprioceptive receptor of the muscle tendon, and also the pressure receptors. So these are the three types of receptors which are going to carry these sensations. Now, what are the functions of the spinocerebellar tracts, or what are the functions which they are regulating? They are our posture and the movement of individual muscles of the lower limb. Now, let me tell you that these sensations are not very well developed in the newborn child. And that is the reason why newborn child is not able to walk. He or she learns to walk as the sensations develop. Initially, they stumble, they fall from the bed, because these sensations are not very well developed when they are born. These sensations develop with growth, with physical and mental activity. And this is a very, very important segment that tells us about the activity of the spinocerebellar tracts. Now, let us trace the neurons. Now, we know the first order neuron is going to enter the dorsal root because it is the sensory root. Here, the axon will end on the Clark's nucleus. Now, this Clark's nucleus is the nucleus dorsalis of Clark, and this is the point of origin of the second order neuron. Now, the cell body in this Clark's nucleus gives rise to the second order neuron, and this will ascend to the cerebellum on the same side. But will all the fibers ascend on the same side? Let me make it very clear that in the anterior spinocerebellar tract, there will be two types of fibers. Few will be crossed and few will be uncrossed. Whereas in the posterior spinocerebellar tract, all fibers will be uncrossed. So the posterior spinocerebellar tract will be totally of the same side, whereas the anterior spinocerebellar tract will be representing the same and opposite side on the cerebellum. Now, having a good look at this diagram, we can very well see that when this sensation enters the spinal cord, we can see clearly that the anterior spinocerebellar tracts are either on the same side, they are ascending and reaching the superior cerebellar peduncle. If not on the same side, they are crossing over to the opposite side, ascending and reaching the superior cerebellar peduncle of the opposite side, whereas the posterior spinocerebellar tract is ascending up on the same side, and via the inferior cerebellar peduncle, it is reaching the cerebellum. It is very important to see here that out of all the fibers which cross to the opposite side in the anterior spinocerebellar tract, few fibers enter the superior cerebellar peduncle and reach the cerebellum, whereas few would take a U-turn and via the middle cerebellar peduncle would reach the opposite side of the cerebellum. So here you can very well see that this type of network is much more intricate, much more complicated. And this can be very well and very clearly explained in the diagram. So the point of entry is the dorsal horn. The termination of the first order neuron is the Clark's nucleus. Ascent is in three forms. The posterior spinocerebellar tract on the same side moves upwards via the inferior cerebellar peduncle, reaches the cerebellum. The anterior would split into two parts. Half of them will move up on the same side, reach the superior cerebellar peduncle to enter the cerebellum. Out of the remaining half, which cross to the opposite side, they will reach up, move towards the spinocerebellar peduncle. Half of them will reach the cerebellum, and half of them will take a U-turn to reach the middle cerebellar peduncle of the opposite side and reach the cerebellum of the opposite side. Means half of these will reach the side where the origin of the neuron had occurred. Now here you can see a section again which we had seen earlier to see how the tracts of the ascending column are arranged and how the tracts of the descending column are arranged. This is simply to explain to you that these tracts are nothing but small areas depicted in the horizontal section, which are actually signifying the length of the fibers which are moving upwards. And we can very well understand that while studying the diseases of the brain or the spinal cord, we know that no lesion or disease would be restricted to any particular tract. It would rather be involving more than one. And the symptom picture will depend on the fact that which part is involved to what extent. Now, when we come to the clinical application of this, the first syndrome which I would like to mention to you is known as the Brown-Sequard syndrome. And this is a condition, a syndrome is a collection of symptoms and disease presentations which occur together. Signs and symptoms which occur together are known as a syndrome. And this syndrome is seen in case of hemisection of the spinal cord. That is, if half of the spinal cord is cut at any level, either on the left side or on the right side, what is the clinical presentation? That is the Brown-Sequard syndrome. Here, below the level of the lesion, we see paralysis of the same side. That is, muscles of the same side get affected. Because why? This is the lesion of the spinal cord, and we have seen that the dorsal column is ipsilateral. So ipsilateral paralysis. And contralateral pain and temperature loss. Because why? In the spinothalamic tracts, we have seen lateral spinothalamic tracts, the crossing over is at the level of the second order neuron, that is at the level of the spinal cord segment where the neuron had entered. And so the contralateral or the opposite side, pain and temperature will be lost. Two more diseases I think are important to name here. One is called the Tabes dorsalis, it's a common term. Now, it is a presentation of a very severe bacterial syphilis, neurosyphilitic condition, and Tabes dorsalis is seen in a very advanced stage, very complicated stage, and it may present with a very big collection of symptoms. What is important to learn here is that in this condition, the syphilitic bacterial infection causes a lot of damage to the spinal cord and to the peripheral nerves. So, likewise, we will get the presentation. There is another condition which is known as syringomyelia. About this I had talked to you earlier when I was telling you about the loss of sensation. Now in this condition what happens is that a cavity is formed in the cervical region of the spinal cord. And due to formation of this cavity, there is certain compression in the segments. And this is a chronic progressive condition which results in the wasting of muscles and sensation loss depending on the neuronal segments which it has involved. So it is not necessary that syringomyelia is going to involve which part of the particular spinal segment. It is involving the cervical region, the longitudinal cavity is formed, but the presentation may be variable. So with this, we come to the end of the ascending tracts or the sensory tracts. And here I would like to tell you something, that the importance of these ascending tracts is more in understanding or receiving the sensations. There are few more tracts which are talked about, which are actually not very important for the first year level, the spinotectal, spino-olivary, etc., and which are quite complicated. So those tracts I have not covered. But When you look at these tracts, it is very, very important for you to understand that the human central nervous system is a very, very advanced system of network of nerves. And these nerves have got a very, very complicated and interwoven type of relationship. And every time you study this system, you will get something new to understand and something new to learn. So when you move forward learning towards these different tracks, you should also learn and understand the presentations in the clinic. Say, for example, I was talking about pain the other day. It is believed that pain is the most primitive sensation, the first sensation which humans experienced. And till date, I told you earlier as well that it is the sensation which drives or which takes everybody to the clinic. So this sensation, this pain sensation is so important that it affects our living, and it is not a simple sensation. Suppose we are in a good mood, I'm very happy, I will not feel the pain. I have something very pleasing around me, I'll not feel the pain. But if I'm already sad, the pain will be much severe. Sometimes the pain is associated with some other component. Say, for example, I keep fighting with my children, but someday if my child says something which is not bearable to me, then again the emotional component of pain has come. So it is believed that pain is a sensation which has got multiple influences. The higher centers have got a very, very strong influence on its maintenance, on its management. Similarly, the temperature. We can feel the temperature, we can feel heat and cold, but we have got a very classical mechanism of balancing of this temperature in our body. The thermostatic mechanism, the thermostat. We all know our skin has got excellent functions to protect us from the extremes of temperature. So when our skin is covering us, when our skin is protecting us, we are not feeling the temperature. Do it exist? So there are very many modulations in all these sensations. And again, before I end, I would like to emphasize that every sensation, though studied in isolation, in individuality, but has got a very, very united and mixed component, because whenever everything is normal, we feel everything perfect. But whenever there is a disease, a lesion, an injury, or anything else, then multiple sensations are affected together, and this brings about a very, very complex presentation. In today's time, we should be thankful to the computerized tomographic findings and the MRIs. We do it in contrast as well, and we can see the lesions and the effects very clearly. So thank you so much.